False alarm. How climate change panic costs us trillions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the planet, by Bjorn Lomborg. Section 1. Climate of Fear. Introduction. We live in an age of fear, particularly a fear of climate change. One picture summarizes this age for me. It is of a girl holding a sign saying, "You'll die of old age, I'll die of climate change." This is the message that the media is drilling into our heads. Climate change is destroying our planet and threatens to kill us all. The language is of apocalypse. News outlets refer to the planet's immediate incineration, and analysts suggest that global warming could make humanity extinct in a few decades. Recently, the media has informed us that humanity has just a decade left to rescue the planet, making 2030 the deadline to save civilization. And therefore, we must radically transform every major economy to end fossil fuel use, reduce carbon emissions to zero, and establish a totally renewable basis for all economic activity. Children live in fear and line the streets in protest. Activists are cordoning off cities and airports to raise awareness that the entire population of the planet is facing slaughter, death, and starvation. Influential books reinforce this understanding. In 2017, journalist David Wallace Wells wrote a lengthy and terrifying description of global warming impacts for New York Magazine. Although the article was generally panned by scientists as exaggerated and misleading, he went on to publish the same argument in book form in The Uninhabitable Earth, which became a bestseller. The book revels in unabashed alarmism. It is worse, much worse than you think. Likewise, in his 2019 book Falter, naturalist Bill McKibben warned that global warming is the greatest threat to human civilization, worse even than nuclear war. It could finish off humanity not with an explosion, but with the burble of a rising ocean. A bookshelf would groan under the weight of recent books with deliberately terrifying titles and messages. Field notes from a catastrophe, man, nature, and climate change. Storms of my grandchildren, the truth about the coming climate catastrophe and our last chance to save humanity. The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And This is the Way the World Ends, How Droughts and Die-Offs, Heat Waves and Hurricanes are Converging on America. Media outlets reinforce the extreme language by giving ample space to environmental campaigners and by engaging in their own activism. The New York Times warns that, across the globe, climate change is happening faster than scientists predicted. The cover of Time magazine tells us, "Be worried, be very worried." The British newspaper The Guardian has gone further, updating its style guidelines, so reporters must now use the terms climate emergency, climate crisis, or climate breakdown. Global warming should be global heating. The newspaper's editor believes climate change just isn't scary enough, arguing that it sounds rather passive and gentle when what scientists are talking about is a catastrophe for humanity. Unsurprisingly, the result is that most of us are very worried. A 2016 poll found that across countries as diverse as the United Arab Emirates and Denmark, a majority of people believe that the world is getting worse, not better. In the United Kingdom and the United States, two of the most prosperous countries on the planet, an astonishing 65% of people are pessimistic about the future. A 2019 poll found that almost half of the world's population believes climate change likely will end the human race. In the United States, 4 of 10 people believe global warming will lead to mankind's extinction. There are real consequences to this fear. People are deciding, for instance, not to bring children into the world. One woman told a journalist, "I know that humans are hardwired to procreate, but my instinct now is to shield my children from the horrors of the future by not bringing them to the world." The media reinforce this choice. The Nation wants to know, as in a magazine, The Nation wants to know, how do you decide to have a baby when climate change is remaking life on Earth? If adults are worried silly, children are terrified. A 2019 Washington Post survey showed that of American children ages 13 to 17, 57% feel afraid about climate change, 52% feel angry, and 42% feel guilty. A 2012 academic study of children ages 10 to 12 from 3 schools in Denver found that 82% expressed fear, sadness, and anger when discussing their feelings about the environment, and a majority of the children shared apocalyptic views about the future of the planet. It is telling that for 70% of the children, television, news, and movies were central to forming their terrified views. 10-year-old Miguel says about the future, "There won't be as many countries anymore because of global warming, because I hear on the Discovery Channel and science channels in 3 years the world might flood from the heat getting too much." These findings, if valid nationwide, suggest that more than 10 million American children are terrified of climate change. As a result of this fear around the world, children are skipping school to protest against global warming. Why attend classes when the world will end soon? Recently, a Danish first grader asked her teacher earnestly, "What will we do when the world ends? Where will we go? The rooftops?" Parents can find a glut of online instructions and guides with titles like "Parenting in a World Hurtling Toward Catastrophe" and "On Having Kids at the End of the World." And so, representing her generation's genuinely held terror, a young girl holds up a sign that says, "I'll die of climate change." I have been part of the global discussion on climate change policy for 2 decades, since writing The Skeptical Environmentalist. Throughout all this time, I have argued that climate change is a real problem. Contrary to what you hear, the basic climate findings have remained remarkably consistent over the last 20 years. Scientists agree that global warming is mostly caused by humans, and there has been little change in the impacts they project for temperature and sea level rise. The political reaction to the reality of climate change has always been flawed. This, too, I have been pointing out for decades. There are, I have argued, and continue to argue, smarter ways than our present-day approach to tackle global warming. But the conversation around me has changed dramatically in recent years. The rhetoric on climate change has become ever more extreme and less moored to the actual science. Over the past 20 years, climate scientists have painstakingly increased knowledge about climate change, and we have more and more reliable data than ever before. But at the same time, the rhetoric that comes from commentators and the media has become increasingly irrational. The science shows us that fears of a climate apocalypse are unfounded. Global warming is real, but it is not the end of the world. It is a manageable problem. Yet we now live in a world where almost half the population believes climate change will extinguish humanity. This has profoundly altered the political reality. It makes us double down on poor climate policies. It makes us increasingly ignore all other challenges, from pandemics and food shortages to political strife and conflicts, or subsume them under the banner of climate change. This singular obsession with climate change means that we are now going from wasting billions of dollars on ineffective policies to wasting trillions. At the same time, we're ignoring ever more of the world's more urgent and much more tractable challenges. And we're scaring kids and adults witless, which is not just factually wrong, but morally reprehensible. If we don't say stop, the current false climate alarm, despite its good intentions, is likely to leave the world much worse off than it could be. That is why I'm writing this book now. We need to dial back on the panic, look at the science, face the economics, and address the issue rationally. How do we fix climate change, and how do we prioritize it amid the many other problems afflicting the world? Climate change is real. It is caused predominantly by carbon emissions from humans burning fossil fuels, and we should tackle it intelligently. But to do that, we need to stop exaggerating, stop arguing that it is now or never, and stop thinking climate is the only thing that matters. Many climate campaigners go further than the science supports. They implicitly or even explicitly suggest that exaggeration is acceptable because the cause is so important. After a 2019 UN climate science report led to over-the-top claims by activists, one of the scientist authors warned against exaggeration. He wrote, "We risk turning off the public with extremist talk that is not carefully supported by the science." He is right. but the impact of exaggerated climate claims goes far deeper. We are being told that we must do everything right away. Conventional wisdom, repeated ad nauseum in the media, is that we have only until 2030 to solve the problem of climate change. This is what the science tells us. But this is not what the science tells us. It's what politics tells us. This deadline came from politicians asking scientists a very specific and hypothetical question. Basically, what will it take to keep climate change below an almost impossible target? Not surprisingly, the scientists responded that doing so would be almost impossible, and getting anywhere close would require enormous changes to all parts of society by 2030. Imagine a similar discussion on traffic deaths. In the United States, 40,000 people die each year in car crashes. If politicians asked scientists how to limit the number of deaths to an almost impossible target of 0, one good answer would be to set the national speed limit to 3 miles per hour. Nobody would die, but science is not telling us that we must have a speed limit of 3 miles per hour. It only informs us that if we want 0 dead, one simple way to achieve that is through a nationwide, heavily enforced 3 mile per hour speed limit. Yet it is a political decision for all of us to make the trade-offs between low speed limits and a connected society. Today, such is our single-minded focus on climate change that many global, regional, and even personal challenges are almost entirely subsumed by climate change. Your house is at risk of flooding? Climate change. Your community is at risk of being devastated by a hurricane? Climate change. People are starving in the developing world? Climate change. With almost all problems identified as caused by climate, the apparent solution is to drastically reduce carbon dioxide emissions in order to ameliorate climate change. But is this really the best way to help? If you want to help people in the Mississippi floodplains lower their risk of flooding, there are other policies that will help more, faster, cheaper, and more effectively than reducing carbon dioxide emissions. These could include better water management, building taller dikes, and stronger regulations that allow some floodplains to flood so as to avoid or alleviate flooding elsewhere. If you want to help people in the developing world reduce starvation, it's almost tragicomic to focus on cutting carbon dioxide when access to better crop varieties, more fertilizer, market access, and general opportunities to get out of poverty would help them so much more, faster, and at lower cost. If we insist on evoking climate at every turn, we will often end up helping the world in one of the least effective ways possible. We are not on the brink of imminent extinction. In fact, quite the opposite. The rhetoric of impending doom belies an absolutely essential point. In almost every way we can measure, life on Earth is better now than it was at any time in history. Since 1900, we have more than doubled our life expectancy. In 1900, the average lifespan was just 33 years. Today it is more than 71. The increase has had the most dramatic impact on the world's worst off. Between 1990 and 2015, the percentage of the world practicing open defecation dropped from 30 to 15%. Health inequality has diminished significantly. The world is more literate, child labor has been dropping, we are living in one of the most peaceful times in history. The planet is getting healthier too. In the past half-century, we have made substantial cuts in indoor air pollution, previously the biggest environmental killer. In 1990, it caused more than 8% of deaths. This has almost halved to 4.7%, meaning 1.2 million people survive each year who would have died. Higher agricultural yields and changing attitudes to the environment have meant rich countries are increasingly preserving forests and reforesting. And since 1990, 2.6 billion more people gained access to improved water sources, bringing the global total to 91%. Many of these improvements have come about because we have gotten richer, both as individuals and as nations. Over the past 30 years, the average global income per person has almost doubled. That has driven massive cuts in poverty. In 1990, nearly 4 in 10 people on the planet were poor. Today, it is less than 1 in 10. When we are richer, we live better and longer lives. We live with less indoor air pollution. Governments provide more health care, provide better safety nets, and enact stronger environmental and pollution laws and regulations. Importantly, progress has not ended. The world has been radically transformed for the better in the last century, and it will continue to improve in the century to come. Analysis by experts shows that we are likely to become much, much better off in the future. Researchers working for the UN suggest that by 2100, average incomes will increase perhaps to 450% of today's incomes. Life expectancy will continue to increase to 82 years or possibly beyond 100 years. As countries and individuals get richer, air pollution will reduce even further. Climate change will have an overall negative impact on the world, but it will pale in comparison to all of the positive gains we have seen so far and will continue to see in the century ahead. The best current research shows that the cost of climate change by the end of the century, if we do nothing, will be around 3.6% of global GDP. This includes all of the negative impacts, not just the increased costs from stronger storms, but also the costs of increased deaths from heat waves and the lost wetlands from rising sea levels. This means that instead of seeing incomes rise to 450% by 2100, they might increase only to 434%. That's clearly a problem, but it's also clearly not a catastrophe. As the UN Climate Panel put it themselves, for most economic sectors, the impact of climate change will be small relative to the impacts of other drivers, such as changes in population, age, income, technology, relative prices, lifestyle, regulation, governance, and many other aspects of socioeconomic development. This is the information we should be teaching to our children. The young girl holding the sign, "I'll die of climate change," will not, in fact, die of climate change. She is very likely to live a longer, more prosperous life than her parents or her grandparents, and be less affected by pollution or poverty. But because of the fear-mongering surrounding climate change, most people don't hear the good news. And because we believe that climate change is a much bigger challenge than it really is, many countries are spending more and more to combat it, and spending it in less and less sensible ways. Evidence shows that globally we are now spending more than $400 billion annually on climate change through investments in renewables, in subsidies, and in lost growth. The costs are likely to keep increasing. With 194 signatories, the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the most expensive pact in human history, is likely to incur costs of some $1 to $2 trillion per year by 2030. With ever more nations making promises to go carbon neutral over the next decades, these costs could escalate to tens of trillions of dollars annually in the coming years. Any response to climate change will cost money. If addressing the problem made money, doing so wouldn't be contentious and we'd already be doing it. If a relatively low-cost policy could fix most of the problem, that could be money well spent. However, it turns out that the Paris Agreement, in its best-case scenario, will achieve just 1% of what the politicians have promised, keeping the temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and at huge cost. It is simply a bad deal for the world. Moreover, it is unlikely that the Paris Agreement or any other wildly expensive climate initiatives will be sustainable. While many people are worried about climate change, most aren't willing to spend much of their own money to solve the problem. Across the world, people are saying they're willing to pay $100 to $200 a year to address climate change. A 2019 Washington Post survey showed that while more than 3/4 of all Americans think climate change is a crisis or major problem, a majority was unwilling to spend even $24 a year on fixing it. Yet the commonly proposed policies will cost many thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars per person per year. When fighting climate change becomes too expensive, people will stop voting for it. Voters have already rebelled against environmental policies that push up the costs of energy. In France, this takes the form of the Yellow Vests movement, and in the United States, Brazil, Australia, and the Philippines, it has seen the election of politicians campaigning against climate change policy. For this reason, less grandiose responses to climate change might also be more effective, because the electorate won't turn against them. Climate policy has to be steady to be effective over the long run, and if the costs of climate policy are so high that citizens consistently turn against the governments that promote it, then meaningful change will be hard to come by. One of the great ironies of climate change activism today is that many of the movement's most vocal proponents are also horrified by global income inequality. They are blind, however, to the fact that the costs of the policies they demand will be borne disproportionately by the world's poorest. This is because so much of climate change policy boils down to limiting access to cheap energy. When energy becomes more expensive, we all end up paying more to heat our houses. But because the poor use a larger share of their incomes on energy, a price increase burdens them the most. In the rich world, an estimated 200 million people already suffer from energy poverty, meaning energy sucks up 1/10 or more of their income. So they either have to use less energy or they have to cut spending on other things. But energy poverty isn't just an extra cost to the already vulnerable, it can disrupt their lives. For instance, energy poverty means that poorer, elderly people can't afford to keep their homes properly heated, leaving them to stay longer in bed to keep warm. The elite use only a small portion of their large incomes on energy, so even dramatic price increases matter much less to them. This is why it is easier for the rich to argue for high energy taxes. In fact, financial benefits from climate policies, like subsidies given to a homeowner for erecting a solar panel, or insulating a house, or driving a Tesla, overwhelmingly go to the richest. In poor countries, higher energy costs harm efforts to increase prosperity. A solar panel, for instance, can provide electricity for a light at night and a cell phone charge, but it cannot deliver sufficient power for cleaner cooking to avoid indoor air pollution, a refrigerator to keep food fresh, or the machinery needed for agriculture and industry to lift people out of poverty. Countries in the developing world need cheap and reliable energy, for now mostly from fossil fuels, to promote industry and growth. Not surprisingly, a recent study of the consequences of implementing the Paris Agreement showed that it will actually increase poverty. Our extraordinary focus on climate also means that we have less time, money, and attention to spend on other problems. Climate change frequently sucks out the oxygen from almost any other conversation about global challenges. In rich countries, this monomaniacal focus means we have fewer and shorter conversations on how to fix our pension plans, improve our schools, and achieve better health care. For poor countries, climate policy threatens to crowd out the much more important issues of health, education, jobs, and nutrition. These are issues that, if addressed appropriately, we know will help lift the developing world out of poverty and generate a much better future. So what is the way forward? First, we need to evaluate climate policy in the same way that we evaluate every other policy, in terms of costs and benefits. What that means in this case is that we have to weigh the costs of climate policies against the benefits of fewer climate-related problems. The climate problems are incessantly highlighted, but the costs of a policy for cutting carbon dioxide are just as real and often hit the poorest in society hardest. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct of a society with access to reliable and cheap energy, which helps produce all the things that make it good: food, heating, cooling, transportation, and so on. Restricting access to more costly and/or less reliable energy incurs higher costs that reduce economic growth. In the case of carbon dioxide, the best research on costs and benefits show that we should cut some, but by no means all, carbon dioxide emissions. We should do so through a carbon tax, starting out rather low at $20 per ton of emissions, equivalent to an 18-cent per gallon tax on gasoline, and slowly increasing it over the century. The tax should preferably be coordinated globally, but more likely will end up with a patchwork of less effective policies. Still, this will cut the global temperature rise somewhat and prevent us from reaching the most damaging temperatures. It will also slightly slow economic growth because that is the inevitable corollary of making energy more expensive. Overall, this turns out to be a good deal. We will examine the inner workings of these climate economic models later, but here is the gist. The cost from slightly more expensive energy translates into a slightly slower growing economy than that over the next century achieves slightly less welfare than it would have without carbon taxes. In short, the extra cost is about 0.4% of total GDP. The lower temperature rise will lead to fewer climate damages over the coming centuries than the world would otherwise have seen. In total, that benefit is worth about 0.8% of total GDP. The simple point then is that it is a good deal to pay 0.4% of GDP to obtain a benefit of 0.8% of GDP. Cutting some carbon dioxide makes a lot of sense. First, it is easy to cut the first tons because these are the low-hanging fruit. There are many places where efficiency can be obtained at low cost. You can stop heating the patio when nobody is outside, incurring just the minimal inconvenience of turning the heat off. Also, cutting these first tons has the largest benefit because it cuts the highest and most damaging temperature rises. But it is also important to recognize the scale of this solution. We pay 0.4% and make the world 0.8% better off. In total, the benefit is 0.4% of the total global GDP. Getting a carbon tax right can make the world better, but not by a lot. An approach informed by cost-benefit analysis also helps show us what we shouldn't do. We should not try to eliminate almost all carbon dioxide emissions in just a few short years. Yet this is what most campaigners clamor for and most politicians profess to want. If we try to do this, the costs could escalate out of hand. Competently done, we would need carbon taxes equivalent to tens or hundreds of dollars per gallon of gasoline in order to effectively prohibit carbon dioxide emissions in short order. This would cost us about 3.4% more of total global GDP, yet the extra benefits would be much lower at about 1%, making the world overall worse off. It would be a bad deal, even if all policies were done competently and expertly coordinated across all nations and across the century. It is much more likely that such panicked climate solutions would be done badly and ineffectively, which could make the total costs incredibly large. We would, in essence, be paying a fantastically high price for little extra benefit. We would truly leave the world much worse off than it need be. Let's return to the speed limit analogy. No sensible person would argue that we don't need any speed limits, just as no sensible person would argue that we should do nothing in response to climate change. At the same time, nobody argues that we should set the speed limit at 3 miles per hour, even though it would save thousands of lives, because the financial and personal costs would be too high for us to bear. And so we find a compromise solution somewhere in the range of 55 to 85 miles per hour. People who worry primarily about safety will argue for speed limits at the lower end, while those who care more about the financial implications of free movement will argue for the higher end. It's a reasonable range for conversation. By demanding an immediate and dramatic reduction of carbon dioxide levels worldwide, climate activists are essentially arguing for the 3 mile per hour speed limit. It's a ridiculous demand, at least for anyone who has to get to work in the morning. Second, we need to look at smarter solutions to climate change. Top climate economists agree that the best way to combat its negative effects is to invest in green innovation. We should be innovating tomorrow's technologies rather than erecting today's inefficient turbines and solar panels. We should explore fusion, fission, water splitting, and more. We can research algae grown on the ocean's surface that produces oil. Because the algae converts sunlight and carbon dioxide to oil, burning that oil will not release any new carbon dioxide. Oil algae are far from cost-effective now, but researching this and many other solutions is not only cheap, but also offers our best opportunity to find real breakthrough technologies. If we innovate the price of green energy down below that of fossil fuels, everyone will switch, not just rich world countries, but also China and India. The models show that each dollar invested in green energy research and development, R&D, will avoid $11 of climate change. This will be hundreds of times more effective than current climate policies. Finding the breakthroughs that will power the rest of the 21st century could take a decade, or it could take 4, but we do know that we certainly won't solve the problem with more empty promises and investment in inefficiency. Innovation must be unleashed. Unfortunately, we are not doing this now. While everyone in principle agrees we should be spending much more on R&D, the fraction of rich countries' GDP actually going into R&D has halved since the 1980s. Why? Because putting up inefficient solar panels makes for good photo ops, and it feels like we're doing something. Funding eggheads is harder to visualize. This is one more cost of the relentless alarmism. Since we're so intent on doing something right now, even if it is almost trivial, we neglect to focus on the technological breakthroughs that, in the long run, could actually allow humanity to move away from fossil fuels. Third, we need to adapt to changes. The good news is that we have done this for centuries, when we were much poorer and less technologically advanced. We can definitely do this in the future. Take agriculture. As temperatures rise, some wheat varieties might produce less, but farmers will plant other varieties and change crops, while more wheat farming will take place farther north. This is not cost-free, but it will significantly reduce the costs of climate change. Humans have proven themselves to be ingenious masters at adaptation. We can look to Bangladesh, which has massively lowered the death toll from tropical cyclones since the 1970s by investing in smart disaster preparation and better building codes, or to New York City, which learned from Tropical Storm Sandy and introduced a range of simple measures like storm covers for the subway system. Fourth, we should research geoengineering, which mimics natural processes to reduce the Earth's temperature. When the Mount Pinatubo volcano erupted in 1991, about 15 million tons of sulfur dioxide were pumped into the stratosphere, forming a slight haze that spread around the globe. By reflecting incoming sunlight, this haze cooled the Earth's surface by an average of 1 degree Fahrenheit for 18 months. Scientists suggested we could replicate such a volcanic effect and cool the world a lot at a very low cost. It could also cool the world very quickly, in a matter of days or weeks. In that way, geoengineering could provide us with a potential backup policy if, for instance, we find that the West Antarctic ice sheet has started melting precipitously. Standard fossil fuel cutting policies will take decades to implement and half a century to have any noticeable climate impact. Only geoengineering can reduce the Earth's temperature quickly. We should not do geoengineering yet because there might be downsides we haven't investigated, but we should research it to find out if it might offer plausible solutions in some cases. Fifth, and finally, we need to remind ourselves that climate change is not the only global challenge. To most people, it is not the most important issue. In fact, it is the least important one. A UN global poll of nearly 10 million people found climate to be the lowest policy priority, far behind education, health, and nutrition. People in rich countries, having much better education, health, and nutrition, tend to be more afraid of climate change. But even for Europeans, climate rises only to the 10th highest concern. For the world's poorest, climate is robustly last. By focusing most of our attention on climate change, we're ignoring other, bigger issues that, if addressed, could make the world a much better place for billions of people. Expanding immunization and curbing tuberculosis, improving access to modern contraception, ensuring better nutrition and more education, reducing energy poverty. All of these are well within our power and, if we focused on them, could alleviate suffering for huge swaths of the world's population right now. Moreover, if we invest more in development, it will also make everyone more climate resilient. Making a community more resilient and prosperous means more people are able to invest in adaptation and preparedness and are far less vulnerable to climate shocks. It turns out that helping the extremely poor improve their circumstances also helps them the most with tackling climate. We need to be aware that when we insist, as part of foreign aid packages, that the developing world align with our climate priorities, we are enacting a kind of imperialism. We are not listening to what the citizens of these countries want. We are jeopardizing their opportunity to lift their populations out of poverty for the sake of our own concerns. This isn't just bad policy, it's grossly unethical. We need to take a collective deep breath and understand what climate change is and isn't. It is not like a huge asteroid hurtling toward Earth, where we need to stop everything else and mobilize the entire global economy to ward off the end of the world. It is instead a long-term chronic condition like diabetes, a problem that needs attention and focus, but one that we can live with. And while we manage it, we can live our lives and address the many other challenges that ultimately will matter much more for the future. In this book, we will start by examining the culture of fear created around climate change. Next, we will ask, what does the science actually tell us to expect? What is the cost of rising temperatures? After that, we will look at what's wrong with today's approach. How it is that climate change is at the forefront of our minds. How is it that climate change is at the forefront of our minds, yet we are failing to solve it? What do we achieve by making changes to our lifestyles? What are we achieving collectively with promises made under the Paris Agreement on climate change? Finally, we will explore how we could actually solve climate change. What policies need to be prioritized in order to rein in temperature rises and leave the planet in the best shape possible for our grandchildren? We have it within our power to make a better world, but first, we need to calm down.